Hey, good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Happy new week after Easter. Hopefully, you're having a good week so far, even though it just started. But Easter has come and gone yesterday, and it was a wonderful time celebrating together, even though we were all scattered, but able to worship together through technology. And of course, this now begs this question of now what? What does this mean for us now moving forward? How do we live in light of the Holy Week narrative, of all the remembering that we've done, the celebrating that we've done, and moving forward? How do we live in light of that? Yesterday, Zach posed this statement for us in his sermon: I can blank because Jesus is alive. I can blank because Jesus is alive. So this week, as a staff, we're going to be filling in that blank in various ways, whether characters in Scripture or certain passages or other applications. And this morning, we're going to be looking specifically at the character of Thomas. This is in John 20, verses 10 to 31. And of course, this is in the aftermath of Jesus' death that we remembered on Friday, and then his burial. Nicodemus makes another appearance in the story here. Of course, we remember that Nicodemus was a Pharisee who was wrestling with some of the claims of Jesus and what he was saying, and came to Jesus at night to ask him some questions in secret. And John very intentionally brings Nicodemus back into the narrative here and shows us this redemption, this saving faith that Nicodemus has placed in Jesus as he's helping to prepare the body. And then, of course, as we celebrated yesterday, the next part of the story is Jesus rising from the dead. Miraculously. And then here in verses 10 to 31, John spends some time on the appearances of Jesus. Of course, we know that Jesus didn't just rise from the dead and go straight up to heaven. Okay, he very intentionally and strategically made himself known and seen to people in the days and the weeks after his resurrection. And so here, First, in verses 10 through about 18 here, he appears to Mary Magdalene, okay? And then later that evening, he appears to the disciples. And of course, we see that they're all rejoicing over what they've just witnessed, and kind of, for many of them, putting these pieces together as they witnessed what happened at his death, and just some of the incredible parts of that story. And now as he's alive, for many of them, it's coming full circle here of what Jesus was claiming, of the ways that he was talking about himself that were so unique, and his claim to divinity. But someone wasn't there, right? One of the disciples wasn't there. It was Thomas. And later, as he comes, and Jesus had already left, and the disciples are trying to explain to him what had happened, Thomas, of course, as we know, didn't believe at first. And in fact, he gave even some conditions to be able to believe. Look at what he says. He said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Isn't that interesting? And I think basically what he's saying is, I need proof, okay? And how often have we said ourselves, or maybe we know others who have said, or we've heard this, that I need proof of God to believe. I need something, whether intellectually or emotionally, to be reconciled in order to really place my trust in God and Jesus. And I think that Thomas often gets a bad rap, doesn't he? As we read through this, we think, oh, why can't you get it? Of course you were with Jesus. How can you not believe? And yet I think we have to be honest. Wouldn't most of us be the same? Wouldn't most of us have the same reaction? Because Thomas wasn't necessarily rejecting God or rejecting Jesus. It's just that he didn't fully understand Jesus's narrative yet. He hadn't really put those pieces together, and so he just needed a little bit more time. And of course, there is this element where, yes, he should have been able to put those pieces together given his experience with Jesus and everything that he said. But he just wasn't quite there yet, was he? And so then what happens next? Jesus makes his appearance to Thomas in verse 26. And look what it says. After 8 days. 8 days. So Jesus obviously being aware of this conversation between Thomas and the disciples, because he is omniscient, and so he was aware of what they were saying. He could have swooped right back into the house and said, hold on, Thomas. Nope, look, here, see. He could have done that and set him straight right away. But he waits a week. He waits a week. And I think that's very intentional there that Jesus did that. Because it might be that even if he had showed up right away, that yes, Thomas probably would have believed, and yet there were still things perhaps in his heart and mind that he was working through, that he was thinking through, wrestling with. And so we don't really get this directly from the text because it doesn't say, but I can only imagine that Jesus was giving him a little bit of room to wrestle with this, to consider all the events of the past 3 years, but also of the past week. And so then when he did come to reveal himself, Thomas was in this place of receptivity, of saying yes. And what happens here? Notice how Jesus interacts with Thomas. Okay, this is in verse 27. He says to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hands. Reach here with your hand and put it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believing." And so this is interesting too, where Jesus doesn't just show up and say, "Hey, look, it's me." He actually interacts with Thomas based on what Thomas had said that he desires or needs to believe. He says, look at the hole. Here, put your finger in the hole in my hand. Look at the hole in my side. Place your hand here. And he uses this tactile experience for Thomas and comes to Thomas's level here. And then, of course, we have Thomas's reaction. He finally gets Jesus' divinity. In verse 28, Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." And so in just a few short words here, Thomas finally expresses, he puts the puzzle together, and he says, "Yes, Jesus, you are divine. You are the Son of the living God." And really, this is in many ways the climax of the Gospel of John here, and John's his whole hypothesis, his whole point here and throughout the book is trying to set the stage for Jesus as the Son of God, as being one with the Father. And then he says here, wrapping up chapter 20 in verse 31, "But these have been written," these being all the narratives, all the stories of his miracles and all these things, "have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." And so what does this inspire you to consider today? Back to Zach's statement. Today, what I'm going to be filling that blank in with is, I can believe because Jesus is alive. I can believe because Jesus is alive. And I think for most of us, we probably don't have a lot of trouble believing in the resurrection, right? Whether we've been Christians for most of our lives or recently, or maybe that's a part of history that we're willing to accept, that, yeah, I'm sure Jesus did rise from the dead, and, probably there's truth there. And maybe for others of us, though, maybe that's not the case, that we are this place of still questioning the validity of Jesus, of questioning whether God is, this God of the Bible, is the one whom we should place our trust in. And so maybe you resonate with Thomas. Show me. Show me that you're actually Jesus. Show me that the Bible is true. Show me that the God of the Bible is the God that I should trust in. Or maybe it could be something else. If we do believe those things, maybe it's, show me that you're going to heal me. Show me that you're going to heal my sick parent, this broken relationship, my wayward son or daughter. Show me that you're going to provide for me in this financial crisis. In whatever capacity we find ourselves, I'm sure that all of us can relate to Thomas in some way of, unless XYZ, I cannot trust God, or I will really struggle to trust God. And for some of us, maybe he will show up in a huge and obvious way like he did for Thomas. But I think for most of us, he says this in verse 29, "Blessed are they who did not see and yet believed." Who did not see and yet believed. In other words, we have been given all that we need to see the truth of the gospel. We see God's revelation and creation around us, and Scripture accounts for that as well. We see him as he's revealed himself in his word, and similar like Thomas's experience, all right, where we see the pieces come together of Jesus' divinity as it's written right in front of us. Or we see his activity in our lives in big or small ways. We can see how he has made himself known. And I think that at the end of the day, we are all faced with this question at some point in our lives. And we have to recognize that either everything that Jesus has said about himself, either all that God has revealed about himself is true, or it's not. You see, if one thing that God has said about himself is not true, everything unravels. There's no gray area here, right? There is no gray area. And so at some point, you have to face that question of, do I believe that what Jesus has said, that what God has said is true or not? And then from there, everything starts to trickle down. And so I think this week, where do you need to believe Jesus? Whether or not he shows up in big ways or perhaps not at all. Maybe he's waiting that 8 days for Thomas. Maybe he's waiting to reveal himself in a specific way to you. And yet we're faced with the question, are we going to, as Jesus says here in verse 29, are we going to believe even though we have not seen? I think for me, a very practical example of this is that I, for about 21 years, have been struggling with a nervous system disorder that is related to my hearing. And it's something that I deal with every single day. It's something that at many parts in the past 20 plus years has been all-consuming for me in some days. And honestly, I thought for a long time that I may never be able to get married because of this, just the way that it affected my daily life and the way that I function. And yet, just a little over a year ago, look what God did. Okay? God brought this wonderful woman into my life, and Lindsay, and we have had a wonderful first year of marriage. And so the point of that is I, for 10, 15 years, questioned whether or not God wanted me to be in a marriage relationship. And it was something that caused in some ways a crisis of faith for me many, many years ago. And yet God was saying, just hold on. Continue to believe even though you have not seen. And not just believe in marriage, but believe in me, he says. Believe in me. Believe in Jesus. And so we come right back to this statement. I can believe because Jesus is alive. I can believe because Jesus is alive. And so I encourage you today to live in light of the resurrection. Live in light of the gospel story that Jesus is alive. We'll talk to you soon.